Well, hi. I'm just knocking out videos today, I guess. So, next thing I'm going to go over, it's the last part of this first section, is the root device volume. I am going to cover off an entire section on storage, so I won't go too deep. I'll just kind of go over it now. Keep in mind, this is the user guide for Linux instances, so I'll go ahead and pop over to Windows as well, but the concept remains the same. When you launch an instance, you get a root device volume, and that contains the image used to boot the instance, which contains your operating system, hence the root device. When they first introduced Amazon EC2, all of the machine images were backed by EC2's instance store, which, if you remember from before, has the data is ephemeral. And that means the root device for an instance launched from the machine image in an instance store volume that was created from a template that was stored in S3, which is object-based storage. Important to note there. Then came along the EBS volumes, and they introduced AMIs that were backed by EBS, which is great because that meant that your data was persistent. This means the root device for an instance launched from the AMI is on an EBS volume created from an EBS snapshot. So if you're familiar with Packer or any of the templating type pieces of software, an image it works like this. So, and this kind of explains the root device volume. You have a VM, right, or an instance, and from your instance, you run a virtual machine, right? So that is the virtual machine. Well, let's say you install the things you want and it's running perfectly, and you're like, man, wouldn't it be nice if I didn't have to do all these post config steps, right? That you might use like Puppet or Ansible or whatever for. Well, you can go ahead and set it up however you want, just like Packer, and create a template. Except instead of a template, what we do is we take a snapshot of the instance. And what you're really doing is taking a snapshot of the EBS volume. And then what you do is you create an AMI out of that EBS volume. And that's your Amazon machine image. And then from that point forward, when you create or launch an EC2 instance, you can launch that instance from your custom AMI, and then your new instance will be exactly the way that you want it. So this is only possible with EBS volumes. The instance store volumes that were stored in Amazon S3 were object-based, so any information that was contained inside of that volume was lost because the data is not persistent. So there's limitations there. You can still use instance store volumes. They do have their place, and I'll get into that in the storage section. But you can only use these instance types for instance store volumes. And we'll cover all that off later. So for here, what we're going to do is we're just going to go over your root storage device, the AMI, and the volume. It's probably everything I just covered, so I will try not to repeat myself. Okay, so you can do a store-backed AMI, instance store-backed AMI from S3, or you can launch an instance from an EBS-backed AMI, which I already talked about. The AMI has a description. It tells you what's in it, what's already installed, or you can do the instance store one. So there are significant differences between what you can do with each type of AMI. And we will get into that a little bit, but just as a sneak peek, let's go ahead and take a look at this. So storage for root device. So here's a nice little comparison. So an EBS-backed AMI can boot in less than a minute. Now instance store, less than 5 minutes. Size limit, 16 terabytes versus 10 gigs. Huge difference. So one of the biggest difference between them is the storage space. Not just how long they take to provision, but how big they can be. Root device, you have an EBS volume. This is an instance store volume stored in S3. Data persistence. For me, this is the big sticking point. The root volume is deleted when the instance terminates. So if you terminate an instance backed by an EBS image, you lose your root volume. Data on other EBS volumes persist. So what does that mean? Okay, so let's say you have /dev/sda, and that's where your root, that's where root is. That's where your operating system is. If you terminate the instance, that will go away. However, if you have a /dev/sdb, and on that you have, I don't know, let's go old school. You have a Samba share. Okay, whatever you have there. Your media drive lives on SDB. If you terminate the instance, that volume will remain there. All right, so let me show you what this looks like. So if I launch an instance, and I'm going to do the Amazon Linux 2 AMI, okay, and I'm just going to do like a T2 micro, okay, and I go to configure my instance. I leave all this just as is, and I go to storage. All right, so here's my root disk. This, if you go back to here, and we're looking at our, was it this guy? Yeah, our root device volume. Okay, so this is my root device volume. Volume type root, and it's on /dev/xvda. All right, it's an 8 gig root disk. All right, now I'm going to add a new volume. Notice the volume type is EBS. You can't choose root because there's only one root. It wouldn't make sense to have two, right? And this is where you have your /dev/sdb. And I have another 8 gig. Let's say I need 25 gig to store all of my cat gifs. Okay. Delete on termination. See how this is by default set to delete on termination? This one's not. Okay, and you can say, hey, don't delete. If you terminate the instance, don't delete this. Just keep it around. I don't know why you want to do that, but and you can encrypt it as well. Okay, but let's say we're not going to delete this, and I go ahead and launch it. And yes, I know it's like open to the entire world. So when you do this, when you launch it, it's going to create your instance, and you're just going to see the one instance. While this is instance state is pending before it becomes available, let's go take a look at my my EBS volumes, my Elastic Block Store volumes. So you'll see here I have an 8 gig root device volume, and then I've got this 25 gig EBS volume that's used for who knows what. I don't know. What we say, cat gifs? Yeah, I just love cat gifs. I need 25 gigs worth. So we can see I have two volumes here. So now let's go back to our EC2 dashboard, or we can just go to instances right here, and we can look at our instances. So I can see here my instance is running, and if I go click on it, and I can see, all right, here I have an instance, it's running. Let's check my storage, and I've got a root device volume, and I've got this EBS volume disk that I can use for whatever I want. So if I were to log into this server, and I'll just do it on the instance connect through the web GUI for speed, because I'm not going to be setting up my key. All right, I'll just do ls block. Okay, so here's my 8 gig disk. All right, and here's my 25 gig disk. If I go to root, you're going to see just a regular list of files you would see in any operating system. But there's no, by default, no, well, there's permission denied, but you're not going to see any volume groups or any of the LVM stuff you would normally see until you set all of that up and go ahead and mount something to it, right? So even if I do like mount -a, like there's nothing attached to this disk, right? So that's up to you to do. This is infrastructure as a service. So what happens if I delete this? Well, let's try it. Okay, let's go over to instances, and we're just going to grab this sucker and say instance state. I'm going to terminate this sucker. So if you remember when we created this, we said to delete the disk on termination for the root device volume, but we left it unchecked for my /dev/sdb EBS volume. So it's going to shut this down, and then it's going to terminate it. And when it does that, it's going to clean up any underlying resources that were provisioned. And if we go to volumes, we can see that our 8 gig volume is gone, but this volume is here. Now, why would we want to do that? Well, let's say this volume has all our cat gifs on it, and we can't just get rid of cat gifs. Those are gold. Like, I spent all of the late 90s collecting these wave files and things that are important to me. We don't want to create one. So if I go to create another instance, and I say, okay, let's make the exact same thing, right? We want a T2 micro instance, and it's going to have an 8 gig volume, and I want to add a new volume. Okay, well, instead of adding your regular volume, the snapshot, so this is where you can see, if we go look at, let me just make a new tab so you can see it here. If you go look at our instance or our EBS volumes, for the love, get me out of here. Somebody didn't feed the internet today. It's being kind of slow, sorry. All right, volumes. This is easier if you name them something that makes sense too. Cat gifs. So the volume ID, let's check out this volume ID. Ends in 52B9. Well, if I come here, you have all these snapshots, right? So you can create a volume from a snapshot, and there's just tons of these everywhere, and a lot of people make them public too, so they're like just leftovers from something that somebody created. And you can attach these volumes. Now these are new volumes, right? So I could say I don't want to do that. I just want to launch it. Launch. And so now I have an Amazon Linux 2 instance running, right? Well, it's pending right now, but it's going to be running. So if I said, hey, you know, it'd be really cool. It'd be really cool if this had an EBS volume attached to it with all my cat gifs. And you can do that. You can just attach. You can attach another block device to this, and for the sake of time, I'm not going to make you wait for it. But you can have servers, and if you're talking about programmatically, especially, say, hey, we need every single server to have this EBS volume on it because that's where all our media files are, or that's where maybe you've got your Git repos synced down to this sucker or something like that, and you need it stored there. You can do that. There's some other really cool stuff you can do with EFS that we'll get into later, but I'll cover that off in the storage section. So coming back to this, that's your overview, right? So your S3 stuff is ephemeral. Your EBS volumes are not. By default, it's going to delete your EBS or your root device volume. By default, it is not going to delete the other stuff. You can change that. However, you have to pay for the storage. So if you're not using it, whether your instance is up or not, you still have to pay for the storage. So you probably don't want to keep it around unless it's for a very specific reason. Okay. So choosing an AMI by root device type, we kind of talked about that already as far as like what kind of AMI do you want to pick. Determining root device type for your instance. We also kind of got to see that in action as far as going to instances and on the storage tab choose root device details, and you saw me choose EBS. If the value is EBS, this is an Amazon EBS backed instance. So you remember when I did the drop down for volume and the only option was EBS. So if I had chosen a different instance type that wasn't T2 micro, for example, it was one of the list, wherever the list is, Does it have it on this one? No, it's not on this one either. Then I would have the option to choose an instance store, and if the value is instance store, then I know that that's an instance store backed instance. Yeah. So, anyways, you can use these from the CLI or the PowerShell module to determine it programmatically. And if you want to change the root volume to persist, well, you just you can do this default behavior in the attribute, or you can just check the nice little box that I did because I did it in the GUI. Configuring the root volume to persist during launch, you can just check the little box, or you can do the mapping for the JSON format. You can use the PowerShell to do it. You can do it in the AWS CLI. There's multiple ways to do this, as I talked about before. It's usually good to learn how to do things multiple different ways. It's the same thing, but you kind of see it in different contexts. So when somebody's like working on something and they're doing something in PowerShell or .NET Core or something like that, you can be like, hey, you can actually do this a different way. You don't have to use the AWS CLI. You can use this PowerShell module. Some Windows guy will love you for that. So what I'm going to do, since I decided to keep this and my instance is about to be gone, I did not choose to terminate to delete the volume on termination. So we're going to see this start to shut down. And if I go to volumes, we're going to see that this is still here. This will eventually go away. This is available. This is in use. So if I go refresh, let's go check our. Oh, that's our volume. Let's check our instances. Terminated. It's gone. This will remain here for a little bit. It'll eventually just go away on its own. So if it says terminated and you're like anal like me and you're like, well, it needs to disappear, I can't have extra things on my screen. Don't worry, it'll go away. And there we go. Our 8 gig volume is gone. So sorry, cat gifs, but we're gonna have to delete this. If you did create an AMI with an EBS back volume and you chose not to delete it, and you want to make a new AMI, what you would do, pretend this is an operating system, is you can create a snapshot, and then once you have the snapshot from AMIs, you can actually go to like an Ec2 Image Builder, for example, and we'll do all this in like a totally different section. You got pipelines and all kinds of crazy stuff, but I'll go back and show you the simple version. But you can take a snapshot and make an AMI out of it. So you just take a snapshot of it, and if I wanted to register a new AMI, I could do that and be like, here's the path, blah, 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 and you can build it. Or I do not own anything matching this filter. You can use the image builder. You can modify boot volume settings. You can do all kinds of stuff. So just know that as far as creating AMIs go, you can create an AMI from a snapshot of a volume. I won't get into doing it all right now, but that's how you would do that. You would just take a snapshot right from here. So we're going to go ahead and delete this and then move on. That's pretty much everything. The rest of this is just how to do it with all the different flavors of the hacker screen, right? So your terminal. So if you can do it from AWS CLI or PowerShell or whatever you want to do. Changing the initial size, again, you can do it in JSON or you can just type it into the GUI. However you roll, I highly recommend not doing all this in the GUI because reasons I don't think I need to describe. But anyways, so that's just kind of an overview of the root device volume. You've kind of seen it in action and how it works and what the options are. And we saw that choosing the AMI, determining the root device here instance by looking at the dropdown and being like, is this an EBS? Is this an instance store? Choosing it to persist, whether you do that in JSON through the CLI or you do it with PowerShell or you do it by clicking the checkbox. And changing the initial size, you saw I made one that was 8 gigs. You can just click in there and type whatever number you want. You can make a 15.9 terabyte root volume if you want. I don't know why you would do that. Maybe you want a gigantic swap file. I don't know. But anyways, that is all we need to cover for root device volumes, and we are officially done with this entire section. So congratulations, you made it. You're now an expert at like 5 things. Only like 9 million to go.